Mom wanted you to skip class?
Well, so she dropped me off. We had lunch and she's like, you should skip it. No. She's like,
You should have brought your mom to class.
No.
I should have, honestly.
Should have
Should have
fun.
let it.
I allow guests. We're still under the quota we're allowed in class. So. Well, welcome to Thursday, everybody. We made it. Woohoo! Yes. So my goal for today is just for us to just kind of have an open discussion about Chapter 5. There was a lot in Chapter 5. So I hope, for those of you that waited till last night to read it, I'm sorry. It's a lot. But, you know, I have some general questions. I want to definitely go through some of the questions from your worksheet, because this worksheet was definitely different than Chapter 3. It's kind of more of just, did you kind of pick up on all the things they're talking about? And I just want to know kind of y'all's general feedback. What were some things that stood out to you in Chapter 5? Maybe something new you learned, or something that was challenging.
One thing that I wrote down that really doesn't really pertain to anything, but I thought it was random and funny, is that they'd never seen a rooster pick up a bug and lay it down for a hen to eat. I thought that was randomly included.
Yeah.
The thing that stood out to me was like the difference in egg laying compared to like the 1930s compared to now.
Yeah, so they did give a lot of history on production types and operation styles, and I thought that was really helpful, that as we talk about welfare and animal rights, we kind of need to talk about it in context, and we can only do that if we really understand where we've been and how far we've come, and then to know where we've got to go.
I like how they gave like both point of views, and they didn't really say which was right. They just said, here's what we know, here's both sides on every different system there was.
Yeah. And I mean, there were a few things that they're like, okay, like we can say like all the data doesn't really support this, or it does support this area. But for the most part, they're just saying, let's educate ourselves and the folks that are reading this book. And so were there things that you learned by reading that you didn't know before?
I didn't know where the term broilers came from, so that was
That's like a really good trivia question now, isn't it?
Let's go in my pocket for later dates.
Yeah. What else? What else did you learn?
There's a lot of statistics, like statistic overload, so I'd have to like read it once and then like go, I didn't comprehend that, so I had to go back through and like reread it to make sure that I understood.
So I think that's a fascinating point, Brooklyn, because we're ag people, right? And what do we oftentimes use to put forth our argument to people who maybe don't understand ag?
Production rates.
Production rates, statistics, facts. So if we're ag people reading a book about ag production and we're getting overloaded, what would the average consumer reading this book, how would they feel?
I'd probably put it down.
Yeah.
Not read it.
It's like I can read this and I can be like, man, I really want to send this book to so-and-so. Like they really need to read it. I'm like, they wouldn't get past the 3rd page, right? So it's a really good point, and I think that should make us think about too, like how do we engage in these conversations with people about issues in ag? Sometimes just throwing a bunch of statistics at people is not going to, I mean, they may be true, and they may be true all day long, but it's not going to be in a way that they can consume that information well. That's a good point. What else did you learn?
the squares and like how like the hens can run.
Yeah.
And they're like the cage free.
Yes. So what does it really mean to be cage-free versus not, versus free range, right?
Like seeing the difference in like the pictures and everything, like, you know, where the caged hens were versus where, you know, they're cage free or closed.
What did you think of kind of, because that was one area that they made kind of a bold statement at the end of the section of like which production style was better or was better for animal welfare. Did you agree with them, not agree with them?
Well, like, judging from the picture and everything, like, to me, the picture on the right looks so much more, like they were more packed to me, and it just seemed more gross, you know, whereas you have these hens over here in the cage, I don't know.
They make the point about even with the current square footage or square inches that we allow hens to have in a cage right now, they still, like, they can move around, but they can't extend their wings. Did y'all have any opinions on that? Or did you just kind of say, okay, that's the way it is?
Personally, I don't try to form opinions on stuff that I don't know a lot about. So I'll read both sides, but I still try to remain neutral. So that way I'm open to listening to other opinions.
It's very admirable. I tend to be opinionated. I don't know. I was thinking about it. I was like, I don't know. I'd hate to be somewhere that I can't like stretch up on. You know, like just that like feeling of stretching. You know, I don't know. Does it matter to help the chicken overall? I don't know. But that was something I hadn't really thought about before. I was like, would a chicken want to? I don't know. I think of our chickens, and we've only got little backyard chickens. They, you know, they come out of their coop in the morning, and the first thing they do is they shake out their legs, and they just, you know, shake and ruffle their feathers. I'm like, I don't know. What else did you learn or find interesting?
That we have the technology with genetics to make it so the broiler chickens don't have any leg problems whatsoever, so it's just not profitable enough, I guess.
Yeah. And they can do it quick because of how quickly they breed. I mean, I think it's every 6 weeks, so you can essentially change the genetic of a chicken every 6 weeks. And that's interesting. The company that did it, it was because they heard from consumers, right? In Europe, the European consumers were like, we're not going to buy chicken from y'all if this doesn't happen. What do you feel like as consumers you'd be willing to pay in order for the welfare of broiler chickens to be a little bit better? And I guess the welfare, what they're talking about is, you know, having sturdier legs and not potentially crushing underneath them the last 2 weeks of their life. Or would you not be willing to pay more?
I think after the college phase, I get a job and I can have money to be able to afford stuff like that. I would like to think I would care more about animals, but right now I like the cheapest.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that goes away after the college phase. I'm still like the person at the grocery store that looks at all the chicken breasts and I'm like, that packet's only $4.05, you know?
Yeah.
I still do it.
Yeah, I kind of always pick the cheapest too.
I don't know. Whenever it comes to meat though, like I'm kind of like scared to go with like the cheapest per se. Like I'll spend the extra $2 or $3 on meat than like, not saying I don't do it on my vegetables, but I try to either do like homegrown or go to the farmer's market and get my vegetables from there and like doing the cheapest, because sometimes cheapest isn't the best.
Since we're on the topic of poultry, anything else you learned or thought was interesting about?
I thought it was funny how it's so true too. I think that consumers associate free-range eggs with brown colored eggs.
Yeah.
I started laughing.
Well, and I totally thought about you, Bree, because you mentioned that you only eat brown eggs.
Yeah.
And they were saying that essentially when they've looked at the economics behind it, that really you're just paying a premium for the fact that they're brown. What did you think when you read that?
I kind of laughed, and as I did that this past weekend, I actually went to the farmer's market and got farm fresh eggs, but they had Americanas, so they had the green eggs and the light blue eggs, and I was like, this is so much better than just my brown eggs. I kind of was like, but it costed me the same as it would have in the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I'd rather do this. I am supporting somebody local B, I know that they are like fresh. And I'm not saying I won't support like a multi-million-dollar poultry business, but I would like to know that I can go drive and see the chickens that are having my eggs.
I have a friend that they have about 30 chickens, and she purposely picks breeds so that she has a variety of colored eggs. Like she just,
That's how my mom is now.
yeah.
And I mean, the doctors, so she's a nurse, so like all the doctors, they'll buy the hogs from us, like whole hogs, half hogs, they'll do that with the lambs, and then they are all over the colored eggs. And they just like, they don't want any white eggs, because we'll get ones that throw a couple white eggs, they won't even take them, they want the blue and the green eggs, like more of that than the brown eggs, so.
It's just something fun, right?
I think, I don't know, if I was the person raising chickens, I would not like ever let their legs break, you know, and just let them live like that or anything. And I would pay more myself just to like have them be healthy and have good lives and stuff. But in the store, I don't really think about that.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, again, it's not really something that's advertised, right? And what I thought was interesting in that whole debate too is that they're saying that, you know, animal activist groups, it's not that they're so much against the broiler industry, it's against the breeders that are used, right? So do y'all remember that part? What was that distinction that they made?
Is it just how they're breeding for like more egg production than like their leg strength or bone structure?
Yeah, their concern is that, you know, for the breeders that are used for the broilers, that, you know, so that they focus mainly on breeding, you know, they're not getting near as much nutrition as they would normally get on a basis. And they're, again, they kind of gave both sides to that, saying, well, there's not really, it's not showing any stressors, it's just reducing their diet to cut costs, da-da-da-da. But then too, about the fact of like the strength of their legs, things of that nature. Like I just thought that was interesting because I've never heard that side. I'd always thought, well, they just don't like the production of chickens because they don't think we should eat meat. Again, kind of going back to that, it's always the vegetarian or the vegan's fault, right? But maybe that's not what their argument's all about.
It also reminds me of the production with the dairy, how they give them, is it that hormone that converts from their bones into the milk, so that way they produce more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the calcium goes to the milk instead. Yeah. With that, was there anything about egg production itself that was interesting to you? That you didn't know before? What did y'all think about all the different types of operations and options there are? So the types that we had, just to refresh our memory, we have kind of the historical, we have the barn system, which is considered cage-free, the aviary system, right? And then we get into this idea of free range. Really, egg production seems to be the most controversial. Was there a certain system that you didn't really know about before? Or one you think you prefer, not that you've read about them?
I thought it was interesting the lackluster of laws the U.S. has for those systems, and like what it takes to be qualified as those systems.
Why do you think that is?
As the U.S., we genuinely care about income profits more.
Do we like regulations or no regulations?
No regulations.
Tend to in ag say less regulation the better. But I would say this is maybe one area that there needs to be a little bit increased regulation. So they make one distinction about being able to call things free range that maybe aren't what we would picture free range to be in our brains. What was that? Like, what's something you can do that would be considered free range? You could still get by labeling your stuff that.
Wasn't it where they were just let out like for 1 hour?
Yeah, they're let out during the day, then pinned up at night to protect them from predators. But I live over by the Arkansas line, and them coyotes can dig underneath the fence, they can hop the fence. Like, I don't know. The free range is supposed to like be more protective, or protect the chickens more. So I drove by one day and there's a coyote just laying there eating chickens. It's like, okay.
One of the big things is, you know, like they talk about the fact that it's kind of ubiquitous to even say, because they can be able to go outside, but maybe it's just like a small area that they just step in one time a day, and they say they're free range, right? So I also think they talked a little bit about that with organic labeling for eggs, and the fact that you can label organic eggs as free range if you can just say that they had access to the outdoors.
Yeah, like a square foot or something.
Right, is access going to guarantee they actually spend time outside?
It also said like they didn't necessarily have dirt to scratch around in outside either, so it's not like they were gonna go out there.
So it's kind of funny how like you say that it's a small area where they can go out. Like I said, being over by Arkansas, there's a whole bunch of home tree houses. And like the free range, that when they were talking about free range, was like you have this like acre that you let all the chickens just go and they'll eat the bugs and everything. And then the farmers will come back and put them inside.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just funny how it, like this one little section where in my mind I'm picturing this acre or however big it is.
So how do we address that then? If we feel like, okay, we have what we say are these labeling or certification requirements or regulations in place, but yet they seem to not really be providing the information to consumers that we need. What do we do?
I think there just needs to be stricter rules about it, because the people who are actually letting their chickens out into like you were saying, like in an acre, then they're actually doing what the consumers think. But the people who aren't doing very much, they say that they're free range, but the consumers have no idea. They're just assuming.
But I think it also falls back on like the association or wherever to make sure that those chickens do get that acre, instead of like, okay, like you say that they're going outside, like just because they put their head outside doesn't mean they're truly going outside. Because I remember talking about this in either like our meats class or my intro to inside, and all the like bad behind all the labeling of the chicken eggs, and how we as consumers also aren't educated. Like they can put that, but it literally means like a foot that they can step outside and be called and considered free range and stuff like that.
So I think there's a lot that even we have to learn about what those different labels mean, and then how do we go about educating people on it?
I start in like ag classes.
And I do know, and I sit and watch a lot of TikTok, so they were talking about how like nowadays they're taking away the ag program, and now there's ag teachers getting on TikTok and having like TikTok ag to help educate, because they realize that we aren't educating anymore in the school system, so they're trying to a different platform.
I have a friend that she calls it Food Label Fridays, because she did her whole research was on how food labels influence what moms choose to buy in grocery stores. It's really fascinating, because again, like, people thought things meant certain things, but it didn't, and you know, just trying to understand that complexity of what plays into decision making when buying. And that influenced her to start doing these, and every Friday she posts a different food label, and some of them are obscure. Like, I have never seen them before in my life. And our whole goal is to say, this is what the food label says it's doing. Is it doing that? Or it says it's free range. Well, let me explain to you what free range actually means. And so now when you see this label, you know what it is you're buying. I have no idea how many people she reaches, but I think that's a good way to try to, I mean, you're not shoving things down people's throats, but if they see it and want to learn, it's there. I don't know.
I think another thing is just reaching out to opinion leaders.
Mhm.
Because they'll be able to reach a lot more people. Because I can post something, but my small group that I have, they'll see it, but that's about it. It doesn't go any further than that. So I think just finding other people who actually have the platform to share stuff.
Yeah. Who would be good opinion leaders for us to go to?
People with a lot of social media following or something.
Yeah, kind of influencers, look at that. You know, I think one, it's interesting, so a lot of ag and trying to like provide some of that transparency or discussion has been, you know, these campaigns to like highlight farmers in the grocery stores. Have y'all seen that before? Or, I don't know, if you buy like, again, a carton of Florida's Natural, on the side you're going to see a guy named Michael Matson. He's a friend of mine I grew up with, but he's took over his family's groves. Like, he's on the side of the carton explaining what his family does. You know, we do a lot of that kind of stuff. Do you think, to the average consumer, farmers are opinion leaders? Or they are opinion leaders? It's kind of a tricky question. What do you think? Think back to what opinion leaders are.
Like, are you talking specifically to people that are advertised on a product, like what you're talking about?
Like
Or just in
that,
general?
or just kind of in general, you know, like if you go to a grocery store, like sometimes they'll have it in the produce section. You know, they'll highlight a local farmer that maybe they got the produce from that tells a story. Do you think that serves as opinion leadership for consumers? I see Brooklyn kind of not sure. Some people shaking their heads yes. What do you think?
I don't know, like, I don't know if them promoting something like, I don't know how to describe that, because like the company that's promoting the farm and the produce is that their definition of opinion, if that makes sense, if that's their idea of opinion leader, not necessarily consumer, and the consumer's just seeing it and.
How many, like, I've never read the side of the orange
Yeah,
juice
that's-
box. Like, it goes in my fridge. Like, I get home, put it in the fridge, and whenever I'm like groggy,
my
I
in my
don't look
refrigerator
at it.
every week.
But I feel like the consumers that like care about stuff like that are gonna be the ones to read it, and so in that case, they are the opinion leaders.
Yeah.
So like to the consumer just trying to buy the cheapest thing, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we need multiple ones, right? So we've got to do a little bit more reaching out and finding some people to kind of, again, I don't want to use the word advocate, but help educate and use their opinion leadership in order to do that, right? 'Cause I think too, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Brooklyn, but it almost seems a little bit self-serving maybe,
Yeah.
right? Like, of course I'm going to tell you everything's great about buying Florida's Natural orange juice because my family is part of their co-op kind of thing. So it may seem like self-serving opinion leadership.
I feel like opinion leader should be someone like that the consumers would trust, and they don't know that person, so it's not guaranteed that they're gonna listen to what they say. It needs to be someone like who has the influence that other people, kind of like a trendsetter.
Yeah. I think that's good. Isn't that interesting too, like this whole idea of like social media influencers, going back to what Stephanie said? We will do things that they say and we trust them, but yet we probably never met them. I don't know, it's just an interesting phenomenon when we think about opinion leadership and that it should be. And again, this idea of someone we know and trust and consider them reputable. A few things that I'd like to chat about that the book talked about First is they really started off this conversation of, when we talk about animal well-being, how do we even measure it? What are some of the things that they said we can use as indicators or ways to measure animal well-being?
Is it pronounced cortisol?
Where they test it and everything, where they said it can save insulin or something
Yeah.
like that.
Cortisol? Yeah. So stress level, looking at stress hormones, that's a really good indicator. What else?
How much they like produce.
So productivity, yeah, and we'll come back to that one because there's a lot of conversation there. How else can we figure out if animals are doing good or not, or happy?
It was like talking about like how horses, you know, like they're more stressed like if they go to like a new place. However, like if they're not receiving food and water, you know, they're not really stressed about that. They're stressed about the new place.
Yeah, so we've got to figure out how to differentiate that. And sometimes that can be done through observation, right? What was something else we can look at through observation to determine if an animal's doing good or not?
They talked about how they can, they did studies on it. Was it cattle or hogs? One of those where they allowed them to go outside, but it was the hogs. They would go back into the gestation crates because
Yeah.
the option was not much better.
Yeah. So we can look at their preferences,
Yeah.
right? And we can kind of set up these experiments or different things to test, like, well, what is the animal naturally going to prefer? You know, we assume they want this, but then also we've got to think about, well, what are those options we are providing? So like in that instance, they were saying, you know, we know hogs prefer straw or soft ground, but if the option you give them is the gestation crate or a big open pen, both are concrete floors, probably going to go to the gestation crate because that's kind of a safer confined area than out in a bigger area where they don't know what's going to happen to them. So it's kind of hard to make a straight decision from that without seeing what other options are available. What else? We've got productivity, stress hormone levels, preferences, observation. What about just their general behavior? What do they say about behavior as an indicator of wellness? How do animals typically react if they're not doing well? They get mean. Anyone had this experience? How so?
This one steer that I had in high school, he would walk by a feed bucket, be fine. 5 seconds later, walk by the same thing, crazy.
Yeah, they're just hungry. Not too happy. So yeah, we can look at their level of aggression, but then even other behaviors like are they lethargic, stuff like that. Any others?
Just whether they're eating or not.
Yeah, so general just like health, right? Like certain things that we would look at to say, do they seem to be healthy?
Their growth rates.
Yeah, growth rates are huge. So that kind of goes back to this conversation of like if, and one of the things they talked about early on was that we tend to get stuck in the argument that we say we care about the well-being of animals because if we didn't, they wouldn't be productive. What's the flaw in that argument that the authors discuss? On page 107, if you need to back on up.
Was it being oversimplified and incomplete?
Very oversimplified, incomplete. It's saying that, you know, we only care about production and efficiency and profit, but that there are many other ways to tell. And so ultimately, it's not just about, well, if an animal is productive or not, then it's being well taken care of. Because can animals be productive if there is some animal mistreatment? Yeah, sometimes there may be more production, right? But what we're trying to find is that balance between how can we maintain profitable production, but at the same time maximize animal welfare at the same time. So that's one of the big things that we have to talk about. And so they mentioned too this idea of 5 freedoms for animal or farm animal welfare. What are those 5 freedoms?
Freedom from thirst, hunger, or malnutrition, appropriate comfort and shelter, prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment of injury and disease, freedom to display most normal patterns of behavior, and then freedom from fear.
So I'd like to hear from each of you, because they talk about this idea of trade-off. That there's, we're probably not going to achieve all 5 of those when we're trying to, again, balance maximizing welfare with maximizing profit. Which of those 5 freedoms are you okay with giving up when it comes to animal production?
I would say freedom from fear, because they could be scared of each other.
Yeah.
And there's
Okay.
no helping that.
Okay.
And sometimes they're just skittish, like, they're
Their
just
breeding,
skittish.
like the breeding could be effective with like how the animal acts too, like go back to genetics. If you get a crossbred cow, they're usually crazy with our
Or,
look
like,
anyway.
In the
They usually-
swine, now you have to do stress tests, because like they can easily just like stand there. We had a gilt, I mean, you just like walk in the barn and she would automatically stress and like be done.
Yeah.
So like she said, genetics, so.
My sister had a ham like that. We actually got her down to the county fair and she ended up dying at the county fair. But I mean, that's normal for pigs to stress once you're hauling them, but
Yeah.
still even in the barn, she'd stress.
Stress, yeah, that pig did not make it far.
That's what happened to me, and we literally had to dope my pig out, but she still ended up dying.
So we don't have a lot of sheep or goats in Florida because one, it's very hot and humid, but also insects, parasites. My ag teacher, he was actually from Oklahoma, and he used to say that no kids of his would ever show goats or sheep because you could look at them wrong and they'll die. It's just talking about fear, stressing them out.
The fainting goats.
But why do y'all think freedom of fear is listed here as a freedom for animals, animal well-being?
Because I do think we do create some fear in animals, just like mishandling them or the way that people use to correct their wrong behaviors. So I think depending on who you go to, they create certain types of fear.
But it's kind of like breaking horses though.
I was
Like,
about to say that.
the first time you put a saddle pad on a horse, it just goes nuts on breaking. Or even just walking up to it, putting a halter on, and still freak out.
But it goes back to one of those indicators of well-being though, like fear creates stress, which increases cortisol level, which we know has a negative effect on production, right? So it's probably included too, because yes, we don't want animals to be mishandled and all that, but for our bottom line too, we don't want high levels of cortisol in our animals either, from a production standpoint. Any others that you look at that you're like, I'd be okay with that being the one thing I trade off?
I was thinking the display of most normal patterns of behavior.
Why so?
Because, well, my first thing went to either horses or cattle mounting each other, and we all know that if it's unattended, that it gets a little crazy. And then I thought about like pigs eating each other's tails, rolling on their babies, chickens pecking at each other till they die. I'm like, if we're not monitoring that, nothing's gonna go good. So I feel like we could give that up the most.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, I feel like there's just some, and again, they talk about it a lot in the different areas, but there's some where that normal behavior is going to really affect bottom line. And so you do have to, again, kind of assess, like, is this one of those things you're willing to give up? Is it okay that the chicken can't stretch its wings out all the way so it can do the chicken dance? But yeah. Any of the other 5 that you would have chosen?
I would say number 3, the prevention of rapid diagnosis and treatment of injury and disease. just for the simple fact that in a lot of cases, it's costs way more money to do that. So give that up.
I thought they made an interesting argument in there that I had never really thought about before, just that sometimes we want to look at these big corporate farms and think that they're just, because they're so big, there must be a lot of mistreatment, but it's like in reality, they're the ones that can afford sometimes that better care, especially when it comes to sick and preventative care. That sometimes, and they said it straight out there, sometimes it's the small farms that are actually treating animals worse. Any examples or personal experience with that? I mean, I can mention to y'all my neighbor that likes to collect dogs. He always has at least 15 dogs in kennels at a time. Can't really afford vet bill, so a lot of times the dogs aren't getting the treatment that they need. Are they probably getting the best food, or are they probably getting fed old Roy? Right? Probably old Roy. You know, so again, just kind of smaller owners isn't maybe always the better thing.
I can't think of like a farm really like that, but I think everyone knows somebody that has just way too many pets or something, or you've at least seen it, you know.
The
on
cat
side of the
lady.
road, the cat. I mean, it's pretty scary.
Like, have y'all ever seen a cat lady's house on TV that it didn't look like those cats were in an awful, nasty environment?
That
I don't think
lady
it's
lives
really
right down
good
the road from me,
generalization.
okay?
Huh?
Said that lady lives right down the road from me.
Oh,
The lady was my English teacher in high school.
Oh, so
Bro,
we're
I
just,
had
this
an
lady
English
has
teacher in high school who was like obsessed with cats, so much that she had like a whole special like room made for them, and she leaves the TV on during the day because she feels like they need TV.
Okay, but I leave the TV on for my dog.
Yeah, I do
So
that with our
I
dogs.
can't, that one I agree with. But like the lady leaves out cat food on her front porch, and now we have like possums and raccoons going through the back alley. And like the other night I pulled in and I thought it was a giant cat. It was a giant raccoon. So, cat lady has to go.
You know, like our teacher has 70. She lives out on a farm, 70 cats, has this trailer, and like they fixed it up like her whole family did, and it was so nice. And she just lets the cats go in and out, and it's disgusting, and she loses at least 30 or 40 a year just because like country, and she can't keep them all inside. And then she'll take like 5 of them to our school and put the windows like partially cracked, and all the kids will like try to get them out or anything, and like they're in a hot car for hours, but she's like, they need to go see like town, and Burlington's not much, so like.
How has she not been reported?
Oh, she has been, but she always has like a good excuse, or I don't know.
I don't know if I would put a cat in my car. Oh,
5 of them.
no, because the only cat we had was a barn cat, and we couldn't even touch that thing.
I think she has to be driving around with a litter box. Does anyone ever
Oh,
thought
That
about
would be
that?
disgusting. Think about that smell.
Her classroom smelled so bad. Like
I was gonna say, what does she smell like?
I know, that's what I'm like, oh my gosh, the clothes, like,
I remember it was our first day of classes, and we walked in, and my class immediately walked out and said we had an FFA thing, so we didn't have to go. We brought like plug-ins, and she would take them out every day, and we would have a circulation of plug-ins to put in her room, and we'd always have to breathe in our backpack.
Oh my.
It smelled so bad.
but like, why isn't the principal stepping in at that point? You know, like at that point, like principal has
Because
to.
we needed her. And like, she's been called in so many times because like, it's terrible. And she's not taking care of the cats in any way, shape, or form.
To me, that's like hoarding, but you're hoarding animals. I don't know.
I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Like, that's psychological.
bad.
I don't know if we can fix that today. So another thing that I thought was interesting in here is that, you know, they talk about like, where can you go to get good information on how to decide or how to even assess animal welfare. So you have these indicators, but everybody uses them differently. And essentially they say you can use expert assessments, non-expert opinion, and then these mathematical welfare models. And what I thought was interesting is that you have experts, these people with PhDs, writing about experts. And what was their conclusion on the usefulness of expert assessments?
It's not always the best way to go.
It's not always the best way to go. Literally the next to last sentence of that section says the usefulness of expert opinion is limited. Earlier it'll say the problem with expert opinion is that experts are people like anyone else. They're not free of bias, and all experts face incentives to arrive at conclusions they may differ from certain facts. Another thing it said is such differences in opinion cannot be the result of differences in information. All experts have access to the same body of information and published scientific studies. One difference that may be is that ag scientists in the U.S. work more closely with the livestock industry than European counterparts. Was that an area that did you kind of just read over it, not really realize it, or was that something that caught your eye when you were reading? Again, and it's kind of a thing in the United States, but we get really stuck on expert opinion or expert assessment, right? With things in ag. We will say, and it kind of goes back to even what some of the Food Radical book talked about just understanding bias that can even exist in agricultural colleges, is that what are they working for, right? And so if they already kind of come in with a notion, is it even possible for experts to be objective? What do y'all think?
Does it kind of depend on the personality of them, their personality type?
Okay. So let's say, so back when I worked at Auburn, one of our meat scientist faculty members, all of her research, it wasn't, so kind of how research is funded, because there's such a decrease in funding to public education, a lot of it has to be sought through grant work and different things like that. So she had all of her research funded by Alabama Cattlemen's Association. They were fronting all the money for her research. Do you think her research was objective?
No,
Why not?
because you probably spend much please people that are paying for your research. You're gonna have to show the results that they're sort of leaning towards.
I mean, you want to hope that that's not the case, but right, if you keep finding things that doesn't support their organization, they may not continue to fund you in the future. The other issue with it is that it can control what she researches. So maybe she attends a conference that has to do with, and there's this other big issue going on in meat science that's an up and coming area, but if Alabama Cattlemen's Association didn't think it was important, she might not get funding to do research in that area. So I say all that to say that's another one of the issues with public funding and education that people don't realize, is that the benefit of us having land grant institutions is that if we're funded by the federal government, it gives our professors, our scientists, more freedom to research the things that need to be researched. And it may not be things that we as consumers realize are important, but because of their proximity to stuff, they know that this is where things are going to move forward, or the research that needs to happen. The more money we take away from there being that federal funding, the more they have to seek out these other sources, the more there's potential for there to be bias in the research that happens. Do we want that? So let's support funding. It's a good thing. And again, that's what makes land grants unique, is that because we're federally funded and we're not a private university that has private donors and all that, we should, in theory, have more of that liberty and freedom to be able to do that type of research. That's why for the longest amount of time, a lot of the most innovative research was coming out of land-grant universities. And unfortunately, we're starting to see a flip in that, and a lot of it has to do with where funding's coming from and who's controlling that. So what do we do? I mean, if we can't just take an expert's assessment and roll with it, where else do we get our information to judge whether something is towards animal welfare or not?
Consumer opinions.
Consumer opinion, so that's that non-expert opinion, right? And why is that important?
Because they're buying the product.
Because without them, there would not be a producer.
Absolutely. Again, kind of consumers always right. They're the ones driving behind the decisions of what we do most of the time. It's interesting, they talk about why is there a difference in what consumers think are important with animal welfare versus what experts say. And it says this difference may happen, and it's important because farms designated by scientists to have high welfare levels may not be the farms desired by consumers. Can you identify what some of those differences may be? Like, how are farms currently designed that you would say consumers look at it and say that's not how I think it should be done?
Farms are designed to make the most amount of money without spending the least amount of money. Consumers, they look at that and they're like, well, you should be spending money to better have the welfare of the animals.
Kind of like you and the whole chicken, like, they see that as like space, like an extra 4 more inches, all that adds up to another cage. So they don't, it's all about production.
So we just have to recognize, again, it's not either or, right? We got to make this a both and conversation. And so both of those things have got to be important. How do we kind of reach that middle in what we do? The other question that I thought was interesting, I feel like it's pretty timely too with other stuff going on. But if experts all have access to the same information, how do they still disagree on stuff?
Different people have different opinions.
Different opinions. But data is supposed to be objective, right? Like, data is just data, and that's how we're supposed to make our objective decisions.
There's different ways to interpret data too.
Yeah. Any thoughts on how we do that?
The way the data is presented is that way.
Yes. That's a huge thing. First off, if you have a bar graph that's shown to you, the first thing you need to look at, right, is the scale on the left-hand side of like what the numbers are. Because you can make things look a lot better or a lot worse depending on whether you make it from 0 to 100 or 0 to 40, right? And most people, if they're just glancing by it real quick, aren't going to pay attention to that. So how it's presented is really important. The type of statistics that are used in the interpretation. So, if we just report, and again, kind of going with COVID stuff, if we just report the total number of cases in a city, it's probably not accurate. Really, it needs to be like a percentage of the population, right? To then be able to compare our city to another city, because comparing Stillwater to Tulsa, very different. But if we have percentages, it makes a little bit more sense, right? And so, yeah, interpretation of data is huge. But then that piece of bias comes into it, right? Huge piece of it. The book talks to, we've already talked about like egg production, broilers. We haven't talked as much about hogs, veal, dairy, and beef. What were things with those production systems that stood out the most to you when it comes to animal welfare?
With the beef, I thought it was pretty interesting. They said that they didn't really pay attention to beef as much because it's kind of already in their natural environment. They're already outside in the pasture.
Fascinating. Do you agree with that, or did you think, no, y'all should really do this more?
I mean, it made sense because everyone was, like, consumers and animal welfare people are more concerned about the things that don't look as good. Like, the chickens are in cages, the hogs are confined. so they're more focused on that. And since they're out, the cattle are out in the pasture, I mean, they're doing what cows do, I guess.
So Florida, we're the 4th ranked cow-calf state in the United States. A lot of people don't know that about Florida. We hardly have any animal welfare, animal rights issues when it comes to cattle because, yeah, they're just there out in the green pastures. They are beautiful, doing their thing, right? What tends to be the biggest area that there's issues with animal welfare with cattle?
Is it feedlots?
Feedlots. Why so?
People just get all worried about them being in a feedlot, not having green grass and.
Yeah. Yeah, the confined space, all in there together, not being able to graze. What's the thing with pasture raised beef or grass-fed beef? To go back to like labeling issues. What's maybe a misunderstanding people have about grass-fed beef?
The grass-fed could still be in a feedlot, but just give them like hay.
Yes. What percentage of their diet has to be grass-fed? Anybody?
I don't remember the percentage.
It's only like 70%. So saying that you have grass-fed beef, they're probably still given some grain and feed on the sides. Actually, I shouldn't admit this. I have a friend that her family has cattle in Georgia. They market it as grass-fed, and they like to the T measure. And once they get to that 70%, they go straight to grain-fed. Like they barely like. They do not. They're doing it to be able to sell their beef at a higher price. Definitely a marketing thing.
I think it's kind of, I don't know. I didn't know a lot of this stuff before college, but once I got into like the meat science and stuff like that, now I just think it's laughable. Just like how people interpret labels, and I mean, I was the same way, so it's kind of embarrassing now, but it's kind of funny too.
Yeah.
One time, like my sophomore year, I was trying to explain to my roommate like what organic meant and stuff.
Or like the no antibiotics, like, oh, that's a struggle for me.
Yeah.
That's a struggle.
Yeah. A lot of people don't know withdrawal periods exist or
Yeah.
anything like that. Yeah. I think there's one phrase that if you could just have it in your mind and anytime you hear something, you just repeat it, it humbles us a little bit of just, we don't know what we don't know, right? So rather than like trying to be an expert on everything, we don't know what we don't know. And it's okay to look back at our past and be like, I made these mistakes. I totally got duped. You didn't know what you didn't know then. And that's okay. And so if we can recognize that about ourselves, I think we can extend that same grace to other people too. That instead of getting mad and angry at people who think this label means something, but it doesn't, we can just say they don't know what they don't know. And we can meet them there and hopefully help provide that information to them.
So if you see me standing in the meat section at Walmart, you know why.
Anything about veal? Any of y'all eat veal? Ever had it?
Okay, I thought that was sad. I did not
That,
know.
yeah, reading that part, I was like,
I didn't know they take them away from their moms right away. And
We do
they
it
have to
here
put
on
them
campus.
What?
We do it here on campus.
Yeah, I didn't know.
So that was one part that surprised you, Bill? What else?
After I got done reading that, I went to this group thing that night for church, and I asked some people, I was like, what are your thoughts on veal, just to see? And a couple of my friends were like, yeah, it tastes pretty good. And then I asked this retired vet, he said, what do you mean? Are you talking about, oh, the poor baby calf or the meat? It's like a little bit of both.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's not as popular here in the United States. I know the few times I've been to Europe, it's consumed, which I think is interesting because, again, they have a lot more stringent animal welfare laws and regulations, but it's more typical to get there. Anything else that surprised you about veal?
I found it interesting they feed them mostly liquid diets.
Yeah.
So then like their digestive system don't like, what's it called, like produce, like grow correctly. I found that interesting. That was just a liquid diet.
Yeah. Anything you'd change with veal? Or do you feel like it, I don't know, it's okay as it is?
If I was sitting there trying to think of what else, I don't know what else to do with those calves that they pull from their moms. Like, what do you do with a Holstein bull calf?
Yeah.
They don't have much purpose anymore because of artificial insemination.
Any of y'all ever seen a full-grown Holstein bull? They're
Yeah.
huge. First one I ever saw was in Spain. I had never seen one, and I was like, holy moly, that's why we don't grow them out. Like, that's a lot of feed to keep that thing alive. I'm like, yeah. You know, and similarly, they talked about with turkeys, there's a weird connection deal in turkeys, but that because of breeding, gotten to the point where we can't really do natural breeding with turkey anymore, so it's all artificial insemination. How do y'all just feel about that in general? These industries that we've gotten to the point where just natural breeding doesn't happen, and we rely so much on artificial insemination. What are the pros and cons of it?
It's more efficient, and the livestock don't get hurt as much.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's sad that there's a point where that some of these animals can't, if given the option, they can't naturally breed. But like, I understand why we are AIing, like, and a lot of it, and I think back to the horses, like, you don't want your $90,000 horse getting hurt because you wanting to live breed it. There's so much more easier and better ways, like, I wouldn't risk it. So, and we're able to do a lot more, putting the eggs in like a surrogate mom and stuff like that, just so we can keep our horses better.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we do a lot of AI for safety reasons of our animals, because again, we see a dollar sign associated with them. We do it for genetic purposes because it helps increase kind of that crossbreeding process, what have you. But then it is that, like something with turkeys, that if you're a turkey breeder or you raise turkeys, it just, we've kind of created this situation where it's not at all in their benefit to naturally breed it. Kind of feel like you've messed with nature a little bit, or at least I do. I don't know. That was just something I hadn't thought about either before. What about dairy?
Well, when you asked about the Holstein bulls, we used to go like, my mom used to be married to someone that raised Angus beef, but he didn't keep those for our freezer. He would go to a dairy like a few hours away and get a couple of Holstein bulls and turn them into steers and raise them in a pasture with our horses, and then that would be our freezer meat, and it was just as good. You know?
I think the Holstein meat is better than beef.
Really? I don't know that I've ever had
But it was also my uncle from Nebraska that gave it to us. But they'd buy a Holstein, feed it out, have it on grass and feed at evening time. But it was still just as good or better.
That and now
And I
they're
mean,
putting
the
it.
steaks are huge too, because like
Yeah.
you said, they get really big.
And
But
I
it's
know
steer,
like a
not
lot
a
of them
horse.
are breeding for like show industry, like they'll do an Angus Holstein cross, just for like the big factor of it.
Our neighbor down the road, he's like, back in my county, there's maybe like 3 dairies left. We used to have a dairy when I was younger. But they're breeding Hereford bulls to dairy cows. That,
That's
I don't know.
I'm just like thinking about that. Fascinating. Well, you know, and a lot of whole dairy cows are in like our ground beef. McDonald's, like if you get a lot of those feedlots, particularly that supply to large chains, that tends to be where a lot of whole dairy goes.
It doesn't bother me.
Yeah. I mean, anything about the welfare of dairy cows and kind of the process of dairy, anything that stuck out to you as you read about?
I didn't know, like we talked about earlier, that they use that hormone to make more milk and stuff, but I grew up in a dairy town in Washington, and I had friends that lived on dairies, and it seemed like their cows were taking really good care of.
Yeah.
Like, cared for really well.
Yeah, dairies do seem to take really good care. It's interesting with that, with hormones, and again, they talked about this with beef and even in swine. the complexity of that argument of meat having hormones in it. And a lot of people say, well, that's why we're maturing so much quicker. What are just some of the counter arguments to that? If you were to talk to someone that was concerned about added hormones in their meat. I think it said, I can find a page that has the
When it
percentage.
referred to the milk, it said that the milk is identical to the ones that are given that hormone or not.
Yeah. There's usually very little difference. It was kind of towards the end that like summarized the main controversies in modern livestock production practices. So it says that in cattle, they usually have 0.4 nanograms more estrogen per 3-ounce serving of beef than those who never received hormones. But a birth control pill can have 100 times more estrogen than a serving of beef. Had y'all heard that before?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we women take it, right? And don't think much of that added hormone. And so there are, I do appreciate that they kind of point out some of those inconsistencies in arguments that I think are worth pointing out. Anything, I guess we've talked about beef a little bit, but anything else about beef that maybe they didn't discuss here, but you feel like would be worth bringing up as far as animal welfare? Good practices, maybe practices that need to be improved.
I think it's funny how it's mentioned it in the book, how they want to use anesthetics whenever they castrate, but animals are given vaccinations and everything. That would be a lot. Like last summer, I worked out on a ranch and we probably did about 400 head of cows just vaccinating them. And that was a lot to do in a day. And I was just imagining if we would have had to put them under anesthetic and just have me like move them and wait for them to wake up.
Or like think about doing a horse like that. Like, no, thank you.
Worst thing I've ever done in my life is castrate a boar. Anyone ever put her on that?
Yeah, but we do ours really, really young. So like we'll hold on to them, and like Dad will cut and then pull them out. We have had to do it like because we were gonna last minute decision to make a pig a state fair project, and we had to go get him castrated, but he was too big, so we had to take him to the vet. And they did put him to sleep and do it like that, but he ended up getting infected. And they said it's just because he's a lot bigger, so there's more infection. From where they're like a little pig, it's a little tiny incision on both sides. You pull it and it heals like that. Where a bigger pig, it just takes a long time.
Right.
My dad's had to like get a horse gelded when it was pretty old already, like had already been shown as a stud, so well over 4 or 5 years old, and he had to like stay up all night with an IV in it because he bled too much. And I mean, he made it, but it's not good when they're hold it like that.
So I think the last thing, we've got time to kind of chat about it. The last thing I thought was interesting is they talked about the mathematical models to help you decide like what's considered proper animal welfare or what's the level of animal welfare. And they have those FOW and STOW, I'm assuming that's how you say it, measures for it. How did, in the swine industry, how did confinement hog farms score with the cell model?
0.6 something.
0.66.
0.06.
Any thoughts on that?
I thought that was sad, but yeah.
So what do we do? Or do we do anything? If that's been what the score is and it's a pretty reputable tool that's used, maybe why haven't there been changes?
I feel like there has been changes. Knowing a bigger breeder in the swine industry, he has had to, now they've made them go through an upgrade, like you have to have this, they've redone barns and had just cleaner and a lot of things like that, but you also have the older generation where they just do not want to change, like they see it and they're like, well, they're good, we're getting enough. So I think that's a hard thing to deal with too.
Yeah. And I also thought it was interesting on the poultry side with the fowl score, how high cage-free scored. Like I don't know, for me, I didn't expect there to be so much difference between cage systems and cage-free. And so, yeah, I just think it'd be interesting to know more how those particular scores have impacted industry decisions, or if they've impacted them at all. Because those were two models that I wasn't aware of until I read this book personally, that I just thought were interesting. You know, it's, again, trying to take a step closer to providing that objective opinion, but assessment of animal welfare. Just a thought. Did y'all find anything helpful from chapter 5 as you think about looking at animal ag production and being able to be more objective when you look at animal welfare issues? Anything from chapter 5 that was helpful in you doing that?
I liked how it just explained the different systems, because I didn't know a lot. I know just a little bit about the different systems, but it gave me an in-depth look at all the different ones.
Education is helpful. And so, you know, I think that's one of the cruxes we're at in ag, is that we have to realize, again, we don't know what we don't know, and so we have to be willing to continue learning about it, right? Like, even though y'all are gonna have a bachelor's degree in ag, does that mean you're gonna know everything about it? No. So we've got to continue learning, and we also have to admit what we don't know and be willing to do that. But then we've also got to help other people get access to this information so they can learn as well. Like, I think that's a big part of it. And one of the big things I learned after that, kind of reading the two chapters from this book in particular. So I just thought it was helpful to have some facts. Even though the statistics and all that were overwhelming, and it was a lot of information, I feel like you got a good resource now to have some good objective data, and also to see how do we engage in these conversations and be able to talk about both sides and realize that, again, both sides have experts that are supporting those sides, right? Even with that same information. So next week, our goal is we kind of continue this conversation about animal welfare and animal rights. We're going to jump back and focus a little bit more on local issues rather than so much animal ag issues. And so we're not going to actually meet in class on Tuesday. And the reason for that is that typically we would have Dr. Hickman come in as a guest speaker, but because of everything going on, can't do that. But we do have a recording of her speaking to this class last semester. And so I'd like for y'all to watch that and complete a worksheet afterwards, which is some questions to help prepare you for our discussion on Thursday. But she is on the board for the Enid SPCA, and y'all know if you know her, she's a professor. She's department chair or chair of the environmental science program. Her background's in natural resources, invasive species, and her family has a ranch in Enid. So I think she provides a really unique perspective on what all are issues that surround local animal shelters. And then I think that'll bring us to our conversation on Thursday of some food radicals, kind of focusing in on Cody Carlson, Trent Lose. I can't think of the girl's name. That's also in that part. So yeah, if you'll just kind of share the news, I'll send an email out just reminding everybody that we aren't meeting Tuesday. But we'll see y'all here on Thursday.
What page do we need to read to?
It's in Canvas, but I think it's like 73. Okay, but like 56 to 73.
Okay.
And if you'll turn your worksheets into Susie today, she'll get them graded for you.
This graded one. Is it okay?
Yeah.
I put mine on Canvas. Okay.
Yeah, is that good?
Yep, if it's in Canvas, you're good to go.
Okay.
Just